I would like to introduce Bilahari Kausikan. He may be familiar to many of you, especially those of you who report in Singapore. He is the former permanent secretary for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Singapore. He has been called the undiplomatic diplomat in the best way, meaning he will actually give you his opinion and tell you what he thinks. So please continue with the great questions. He served in the ministry for 37 years and was had appointments both here in Singapore as well as abroad, including being the ambassador to the Russian Federation. So he is, as I said at the beginning of the last session, China is something that has been front and center throughout all of the sessions, really, that we've had. Popping up in a different way have been other issues, so not just questions about China and Taiwan, but Russia and Ukraine, Gaza and Israel and the US and India. These are things that have all come up in different ways. And so he is going to start out by talking a bit about sort of these global conflicts and how they may play into trade, especially in this region. But then we'll be opening it up to questions from you all. So please join me in welcoming back Bilahari.
Thank you for inviting me again. I think this is the third time, which seems to be a little bit reckless on your part, but never mind. But I'm glad to be here. Now, I am going to make a few opening remarks, but I would like this to be a dialogue rather than a monologue. So I'll make these opening remarks as brief as possible. First, some very general observations, which I think need to be made because they're often ignored, although they're quite obvious. Whether you are a person working in a foreign ministry or a journalist, I think we all generally pay far too much attention to events, as we must, and not enough attention to the processes in which events are necessarily embedded. Right? And therefore, sometimes we lose perspective. Right? I think unless you've been living on the far side of the moon, and even then, because the Chinese just sent back one of their space probes from the far side of the moon, it would not have escaped your notice that we are living in turbulent times, right? There's a conflict, there's a war in Ukraine, there's a war going on in Gaza, there is strategic competition between the US and China as a new structural condition of international relations, and so on and so on. But I think to put this in perspective, we have to understand that competition, and therefore at least the possibility of conflict, these are inherent characteristics of international relations. There is nothing unusual about the times we live in. And it's a fundamental mistake to think that any international order is necessarily uncontested. In fact, for most of history, and certainly for 40 years or so after the end of the Second World War, it was the contest that defined the international order, the contest between the US and the Soviet Union. It was only a very short, historically exceptional period, abnormal even, you may call it, of about 20 years or so after the end of the Cold War, after the Berlin Wall came down, when the US was so overwhelmingly dominant that this fundamental reality that competition and conflict are inherent characteristics of international relations was for a short period masked by that power. And even then, there were wars. The US invaded Iraq, and Afghanistan, there were numerous wars in Africa, which nobody bothered to mention. There were at least small low-level intensity conflicts between Israel and Hezbollah, and between Israel and Hamas. The current war is the fifth, I think, if I counted correctly. Right. And it's a fundamental mistake to mistake that exceptional period for the norm. What we are experiencing now is the norm. That was the exception. However, there's a lot of hankering over that exceptional period and wishful thinking that that should be the norm. Now, I think for most people in this room, or for most of us, the countries we come from, the exceptional period was very beneficial to us. And by the way, that also was beneficial to China. But just because it was good for us doesn't mean make it any less exceptional. And certainly it doesn't make it replicable. So I think we have to start with that firmly in our minds, right? Um, I was asked to talk about Asia's role in the world, in world conflicts and the world economy, and I'll try to do so briefly indirectly. I'm sure all of you, at some point, at least I have, used the trope of an Asian century, replacing what was allegedly an American century. But I repeat a point I just made: the American century was never uncontested. And the Asian century, I don't believe that there is going to be an Asian century, except in the most trite term. And in fact, I'm in good company in not believing there will be an Asian century. And I can cite as an authority nobody less than Deng Xiaoping. In 1988, Deng Xiaoping met Rajiv Gandhi, who was then Prime Minister of India, and told him that people are talking about an Asia Pacific century as if it's going to be kind of a, it's going to happen automatically. And he said, I don't believe it. Right? And I don't believe it because it means that all the countries have to grow simultaneously. And to add to that, I think Asia, except in a purely geographic sense, which is the most trite sense, is just too incoherent a concept to define a century by it. Some of the most important potential conflicts, anyway, are in Asia: India, China, China, Japan. China, US strategic competition. US is an Asian power because it's a Pacific power, at least, right? Uh, and so on. There are various degrees of conflicts. So I don't believe in this idea of an Asian century, except in the sense that certainly we are living in a world that is no longer dominated completely by the US. And among the countries that are playing a bigger role are several Asian countries: India, Japan, middle powers, uh, Korea, North and South, and so on. You know all these things. Um, my second point, and I'm skipping from point to point just to give you a framework. I mentioned a moment ago that US-China competition is a new structural reality of international relations, which will be with us for a very long time. Uh, Time measured in decades, not just a few years. There will be periods of high intensity competition, periods of low intensity competition. Um, but it's going to be with us. Being with us, I think we need to understand both the US and China in perspective. One of the most important things that has happened in the last 10 years across the world, including in Southeast Asia, sometimes not talked about, is that I think we have a much more balanced view of China and the US now. It used to be that, almost that China could do no wrong and the US could do no right. Now I think there's a more balance. I mean, China has serious structural problems. I heard the last end of your last presentation, and when you talk about China, you can always say, is the glass half empty or half full, right? But whether it's half empty or half full, it's still a big glass, right? I don't believe in this idea of peak China, because what does it mean? Peak. The metaphor implies something that is of finite quality. Then you can reach a peak, and then it runs down. But growth, in principle, is endless. It can be fast growth, it can be slow growth. But growth doesn't stop unless the whole place collapses, which is not going to happen in the case of China. And even a China at slow growth, like last year, 5 point something percent, that's about the size of an Australia being added to the Chinese economy and the world economy. So yeah, China has very serious structural problems. Debt. I just heard the last part of the thing. He's talking about household debt, but that's not the debt problem. The debt problem is local government debt. The local governments just account for about, it's a very serious fiscal imbalance. The local governments account for something like 55% or so, or a bit more maybe, of revenue. But they account for more than 80% of the expenditure. And this is simply not sustainable. There are other structural problems, and the longer term one is, of course, demographics, which you all know about. And all of them, to me, stem from a very fundamental fact about China that is not sufficient. It's so obvious that we tend to become invisible. China is a communist country, not in its ideology anymore. You'll probably find more believers in class struggle in American universities or European universities than in China, but certainly in its political structure. It is a Leninist system led by a vanguard party that claims a monopoly of power. And the most important value of the vanguard party is to maintain control. That trumps everything else. And I think one of the problems we had for many years is that we forgot that the purpose of reform in a Leninist system is to entrench the control of the Leninist party. And that, to some degree, limits what it's prepared to do. Some years ago, quite a long time ago actually now that I think of it, 2012, the 18th Party Congress, the party itself admitted that its model that, gave it spectacular growth in the 1990s, in the early part of the 2000s, were not sustainable. And they rolled out a new model that promised, to cut a long story short, more economic efficiency, a decisive role for the market in allocating resources. Very little of that has been implemented. In fact, under Xi Jinping, the trend has been the other way, much more control. Now, control and economic efficiency, these are diametrically opposite values because more efficiency, more market efficiency means less control. It's not an absolute choice. It's a question of finding a new balance, but the balance has tilted, at least in the last 10 years, in the direction of control. And there are good reasons for it. I'm not saying this is illogical, from the, if we think something is illogical, it's usually because we have failed to grasp the first premise. And the first premise of China is to maintain party control. And whatever Xi Jinping is, I think, frankly, he's very mediocre at governance, because his values are different. But he's a genius at amassing power. What? What? I said quite a brave man you are. Why? He is mediocre. I've said it in public, actually. Look at what can you tell me of any initiative he took in the last 10 years that is an unqualified success? Nothing has been a failure. That's true. That's why I don't say it's a failure. I just say it's mediocre. But nothing is an unqualified success, including his signature Belt and Road thing, right? Which they don't boast about so much anymore. Right? Right? What? Tell me one thing that's unqualified success. Don't say the eradication or extreme poverty, because that's not his work. That's the work of many leaders. But it just happened under his watch. All right? What has he done that is unqualified success? Nothing has been bad. Nothing is a total failure, but nothing is unqualified success. And he's mediocre at governance because his idea of governance is more party control. He is an apparatchik to the marrow of his bones. His solution to everything is more control. But anyway, that doesn't mean that China, as I said, you can talk about the glass half empty, half full, but it's a big glass. And it will remain a big glass despite its structural problems for quite some time. Right? On the other hand, the US is a mess. The US politics is a mess. I mean, it's you got to be really blind and on the far side of Mars not to see that. On the other hand, many years ago, I won't tell you how many years ago because I'll reveal my age. I was a graduate student in the US for 4 years. And the most important thing I learned about the US is that the most important things about the US do not necessarily happen in Washington, D.C. I'm not saying Washington, D.C. is not important. Of course, it's important, but it's not the most important things about the US. Because the US was founded by people who basically distrusted strong government and therefore weakened the government deliberately. Now, we can argue that it's probably much more weak and disorganized than absolutely necessary. But, the US government is dysfunctional by design. It's politely called checks and balances. All right? Okay. All right. The most important things about the US, there are two things I took away from 4 years of graduate study in the US. One is a taste for bourbon, and the other is this insight that the most important things of the US do not happen in Washington, D.C. They happen in civic organizations, in big corporations, on Wall Street, in research laboratories, in universities, on main streets of the 50 states. Washington, D.C., of course, has influence, but often the most important things happen despite Washington, D.C., not because of Washington, D.C. And that's been true in different levels of intensity throughout US history. I am old enough to know, to wonder at least, yes, Washington, D.C. is polarized, the politics is dysfunction, is polarized. But I am old enough to wonder, but this is not the worst I've seen of the US. I think the 70s, the latter part of which I lived in the US, in the 60s, were much worse. The political turmoil, which resulted in several assassinations. We haven't quite come so far yet, touch wood, okay, touch wood, that it won't come to that in this time. But I don't think the polarization and all that is as bad as it was then. Yeah, you have these demonstrations about Gaza and the universities, but the demonstrations over the Vietnam War were far worse. Why? Because Americans were dying. It's one thing to be concerned about Palestinians dying. It's another thing to be concerned because you may die. So that's another issue. So I think we have to see both the US and China in perspective. They are both normal countries, big countries, important countries, but normal countries with their own strengths and their own weaknesses. Right? We also should understand US-China competition correctly. One of the things, and I've said it to previous groups here, that irritates me no end, is this trope of US-China competition being a new Cold War. There are superficial similarities, but I think they are only superficial. And that trope, that historically inaccurate metaphor, uh, misrepresents what is fundamental about their competition. The US and the Soviet Union led two separate systems, and their competition was an existential one to see which was the better way of organizing modern industrial society, right? We know the answer to that now. And all economies now are actually mixed economies. They differ only in the different balance between the market and the planned elements. Planning, by the way, is not confined to China or Vietnam or the socialist economies, the five remaining Leninist economies. In the West, planning is called regulation, right? But it's planning. So it's only the mixture. So we all mix economies. And that makes a big difference. It's not a competition between two types of systems. It is competition within a single system. And that system is defined by a historically new phenomenon that grew up during that short, exceptional period I talked about a moment ago. And these are supply chains of a complexity, of a density, and of a scope never before seen in world history. In which this is what distinguishes 21st century interdependence from earlier periods of interdependence. There's never been something like that. I think we still don't know quite how complex this supply chain is. In fact, I always also I think the metaphor of a chain oversimplifies it because a chain is essentially a very simple linear structure. I think a better metaphor is to think of a tree. You have a complex root system with a trunk leading to branches, leading to twigs, leading to capillaries of leaves, right? And there's a whole forest of these trees. And I find it very difficult to think of this very complex global system within which the US and China compete, bifurcating completely across all domains. There will be partial bifurcation, already has occurred, right? But even that is partial. I don't think, for example, you can completely bifurcate even in high technology areas. Because for a simple reason, China is, say, just take semiconductors. Semiconductors, the last time I checked with somebody, is about 40% of the world semiconductor market. How the hell are you going to cut off 40% of your own companies from 40% of any market, even the market for gummy bears, without doing them irrevocable damage? So you can't, In short, it's a complex competition, and it's also not an existential competition. They are trying to gain advantage over each other. They may want to dominate the system or retain the dominance in the case of the US, but that's a very different thing from one system wanting to replace the other. Right? And I don't think this complexity is going to be erased by wrapping it up in simplistic binaries like, the competition between authoritarianism and democracy. That's nonsense, because there are many types of democracies and there are many types of authoritarianism. And at least in Asia, I don't think we consider every aspect of the Western variant of democracy with unqualified admiration, nor do we recoil with horror from every aspect of every variant of authoritarianism. Right? So it's a stupid way of framing the thing, because I tell my American friends, this is not going to win you any support except among the already converted. In fact, it's going to make people more wary. Right? Okay, so this competition within a system, the dynamics are different. They are complex, not binary, and it's not existential. Um, Let me say that this competition, because it is a structural condition of reality, is going to go on for the indefinite future. Sometimes high intensity, sometimes low intensity. Uh, there's always going to be a risk that competition becomes conflict. But frankly, maybe counterintuitively, I don't think the risk is inordinately high for a couple of reasons. One, of course, if you look at whatever you may think of the Chinese leadership, they are not gamblers. And they are not going to roll the dice with the most important thing to them, which is the continuation of party rule. Right? And if they go to war, that's rolling the dice in a big time way. I'll come back to that. If there is a risk, it's going to be conflict by accident, by miscalculation, not war by design. By war by design, I mean war being used as an instrument of policy, such as what Mr. Putin is trying to do in Ukraine, right? And mucking it up. Not as badly as before, but still, we'll come back to that if you want to talk about that later. So the risk is accidents getting out of hand. And I think the other factor that makes this the main risk, not war by design, is something that we don't talk about much in Asia, yet it is the most profound development in international relations in the last almost, 1945 to now, almost 80 years. And that's the nuclear dimension. Nuclear deterrence kept the peace between the US and the Soviet Union. There were a lot of proxy conflicts, but they never went to war. Right? Right? And I think it will keep the peace between the US and China. There may be some people around who are foolish enough to become proxies, but if you can avoid that, why? There's only been one case of direct conflict between two nuclear weapon states. Do you all remember what it is? 1999, Kargil, between Pakistan and India. And even then, although the Pakistanis took a thrashing, they never escalated because it's just too dangerous. Right? And Indians were wise enough to let them have a kind of face-saving way out. Now, so I think this competition can be managed. There are many, in fact, I would say even most international issues have no solutions. That's good news for diplomats and journalists, because it means we'll never be out of a job, right? Unless the whole journalistic profession changes, which it is, as you all know better than me. But it can be managed. Sometimes you manage it better, sometimes you manage it worse, right? And let me talk about two issues there is no solution to me, but can be managed. And this is Taiwan and Gaza. All right. Taiwan, frankly, there is the prospect of a voluntary reunification is nil. Right? Why would the Taiwanese want to voluntarily reunify? There is no support in Taiwan, and many opinion polls. Any Taiwanese here? I just came back from Taiwan. I'm going next week again. Right? I mean, there are many. You know this better than me. There's no support for the two extremes of unilateral independence or reunification. Most people want the status quo to remain. And I think the status quo can be maintained. There are only two scenarios where I think that the Chinese must fight. They are not keen, by the way. They never renounce the use of force. But I don't think that's their preferred option because, as I said, it's just too big a gamble. And if they fail, Mr. Putin can fail to achieve his goals in Ukraine. He's still sitting in the Kremlin. There is no Chinese leader that can do something against Taiwan and fail and remain in power. And even the roots of party rule will be shaken, right? So they are not gamblers. And there are other things they can do short of launching a war. But I think there are two scenarios where they must fight because no Chinese leader can, under those two scenarios, not fight and retain his power. The first is a very low probability, high impact scenario, which is if Taiwan revives its nuclear weapon ambitions. It had such ambitions in the 1970s and was pursuing them quite well, I would think, with the help of Israel and South Africa, until the Americans found out and slapped all three of you down and said, stop this nonsense. But the world has changed. I think it is almost inevitable that South Korea and Japan will become nuclear weapon states, probably within my lifetime, despite my advanced years. Provided I don't get run over by a bus after leaving you all. Okay. Certainly within your lifetime, since you're all much younger. Right? And when that happens, there will be a lot of pressure in Taiwan. I think the pressures can be resisted. So, but that's a very low probability but high impact scenario. If Taiwan revives its nuclear weapon ambitions in any credible way, China must fight. Because if Taiwan becomes even a threshold state, this idea of reunification, even as a distant dream, is over. And that strikes at the heart of the narrative by which the Communist Party legitimates its right to its monopoly of power. And they cannot tolerate that. But it's a low probability scenario. Not zero, but low. The higher probability scenario is if Taiwanese domestic politics takes some strange turn. Right? I said there is no support. I don't think the risk is some Taiwanese politician will one day get up and think it's a jolly good idea to declare independence, because there's no support. There's no political gain to be derived from doing so. But there are red lines. Right now, there is, and you Taiwanese know this better than me, there is a Taiwanese Chinese identity which is different from the mainland Chinese identity. So that really hollows out the idea of one China, except as a slogan. It hollows out the 1992 consensus, except as a slogan. And that actually is what the KMT and the DPP and any third party will have in common. And because you have it in common, you have to defend Taiwanese sovereignty in one way or the other. And then that may cross red lines, short of unilateral dependence. And it's a tricky situation because I don't think even Beijing knows what those red lines are until they are crossed. Right? And what constitutes a red line today may not be tomorrow, and what is not a red line today may become one next week or next month. And that's tricky. And the trickiness is, I've been observing Taiwan and going there since the first time I set foot in Taiwan is 1976. Right? And I've been going there quite regularly. There was a hiatus where I didn't go, and I just came back, and I'm going next week again. I think there are two things I observed over this long period of time that are disturbing in the context of Taiwanese domestic politics. First of all, there has been a diminution in the Taiwanese will to defend itself. Ukraine gave it a shock, but I don't think a big enough shock to completely reverse this trend. Some of you remember, I can't remember, it's during Ma Ying-chou's time when there was a training accident and a conscript died. And two defense ministers had to resign, and you reduce the period of conscription to 4 months. Now, 4 months is a joke. In 4 months, you can teach a soldier, provided he's reasonably intelligent, not to shoot himself in the foot and not to shoot his comrade, okay? Now you have increased it, I think, to a year, which is not better than 4 months, but not enough. Right? And more to the point, if you ask any American defense contractor, you are not buying enough of the right kind of weapons. Right? Why? Because what you need are sea drones, you need you need sea mines, you need anti-ship missiles. These don't make for good parades. Abraham tanks make for good parades. And I asked somebody, why you want Abraham tanks? Because if the Chinese land is over, the point is to stop them far away, not let them land. And tanks are useless for that. You need some, you need aircraft, which you are going to get, I guess. Um, but I think that will to defend yourself, I am very skeptical, frankly, among the elite. The Abeng Alliance, they got no choice. They have to fight, right? But the elite are frankly very skeptical. And that is irrespective of their political affiliation. Right? Secondly, I see, as this will to defend itself declines, I see a rise in the sense of entitlement. I am the only Chinese democracy, so of course somebody has got to help me. And nowadays, I am the only Chinese democracy and I have chips. So of course somebody must help me. Now these two trends are in the context of Taiwanese domestic, I think can lead to some disturbing scenarios. I think the day is not upon us yet, but it can lead there. Let me end with a few words on Gaza. Gaza is the international problem par excellence, which there is no solution. It can only be managed. It's been ill managed for quite a long time. It could be better managed. And there's a lot of hypocrisy around it. This is all not for publication, but I'll tell you this. None of the Arab governments give a damn about the Palestinian issue. Right? Ever since they fought 3 wars against Israel, lost all of them. Egypt and Jordan normalized relationship. And after 1979, the Iranian Revolution, the main geopolitical issue has been Iran, particularly for the Gulf monarchies. Because don't forget, it's not just a Sunni Shia thing. It is the Islamic Republic of Iran, and probably to the Gulf monarchies, that is a bigger threat than the Sunni Shia thing. It's a republic. And the kind of revolution they are trying to ferment is a Republican revolution. And since then, that has been the main focus. There's a lot of lip service in the UN and elsewhere about the Palestinian cause. But where has the Arab governments poured the most money in ever since 1973? Which cause? It is the Iraq-Iran war, because that was really existential to them. And after the Arab Spring, there was a further issue. They knew that they had to reform their own systems. And of what use is the Palestinians to that cause? Who can help? Right? And that's the underlying basis of what we call the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords, to put it in stark terms, is an American-sponsored anti-Iranian alliance. And that is why, despite all the wringing of hands and gnashing of teeth and rendering of clothes over Gaza and the civilian casualties, not a single member of the Abraham Accords has left it. And Saudi Arabia will eventually join. Not imminently, it's not going to happen in the next few years because of Gaza, but they have been cooperating with Israel quite very well, because that is the real issue. Therefore, there is no solution. I will go even further. I go to Israel quite often, and every 2-3 trips I go to the West Bank. I'm not so suicidal to want to go to Gaza, but I go to the West Bank very regularly. And I came to the very sad conclusion that none of the principal players on the ground, which are the Israeli right, and there's no more Israeli center, by the way, these days after 7 October. No more Israeli left, definitely, and a very, very weak center. And the center has shifted rightwards too. Not the Israeli right, not Fatah or the Palestinian Authority, and certainly not Hamas. They don't want a solution. They talk about a solution. Why? Because a solution will be a disaster for all of them. Another Nakba. Why? Because what keeps them in power is some level of conflict. I have a very good friend. I have a very good friend. When the last time I went to West Bank, which just before COVID, he had just resigned from the Palestinian Authority. He was a minister. And I asked him why he resigned. He told me, well, we failed in the struggle, we failed in governance. So I don't want anything more to do with this. Right? And and that's the sad say. No, look, just think. That is the land of miracles. So maybe a miracle will happen. There will be a two-state solution, right? But what does a two-state solution mean for whoever, say, the Palestinian Authority? What it means that overnight it will cease to be an international cause célèbre, attracting all kinds of aid, mainly from silly Europeans, and become just another ill-governed, corrupt third world state, which means aid will dry up because it has no strategic importance as a state. Right? Its strategic importance now, insofar as it has in much diminished, is because there is a conflict, right, at some level. That's the hard fact. So I'm not saying this is the ideal state of affairs. We all talk about two-state solution, and I think most people would at least formally say that we are in support of most countries of a two-state solution. But I have not seen anybody come up with a viable pathway to a two-state solution. And right now, because of 7 October and the consequent war, there is a very fundamental contradiction. Any kind of two-state solution must rest on a foundation of stability. And that foundation of stability must rest on Israel's ability to deter its enemies, both state and non-state. I think they have done pretty good a pretty good job in deterring the state, the former enemies, the states, right? But they are doing a lousy job of deterring the non-state actors, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or there are innumerable smaller groups, right? But what they need to do, and they are doing now with gay abandon in Gaza to restore deterrence, is going to make any pathway to a two-state solution even more difficult. And there are at least substantial numbers of Israelis and Palestinians that do not want a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution. So it can be better managed, but there is no solution. That's not, we all, to the Arab countries, to most Southeast Asian countries, to most countries in the world, the Palestinian issue is actually a domestic political problem to be managed. Right? And that's the hard reality. Of course, if you write all these things, you will be howled out of your newsrooms. And if I say all these things in public, people will throw stones at me. But that is the harsh fact of life. Right? Okay, I'll stop here and take your questions. Wow, so many. All right.
My name is Uzmi. I'm from India. Uh, just I wanted a clarification that when you say can be better managed, the Gaza situation, what do you mean exactly? Just wanted to
What
understand
we
that.
have to do, and this also applies to Taiwan, all of us have to, in the case of Taiwan, keep the myth that there will be eventually a reunification alive in a credible way. And in the Palestinian issue, we have to keep the myth that there will be one day two states alive in a credible way. Right? People are doing a better job, a slightly better job in the case of Taiwan than in the case of Gaza. That's what I mean. Because a lot of international relations and diplomacy consists of keeping myths credibly alive so that people did not take drastic actions, which gives you something to write about and gave me, before I retired, employment. Sorry, somebody else had questions.
Yeah, I'm Nathan Cook. I'm a journalist based in Japan. I used to be based in Southeast Asia. When I travel the region, countries like Indonesia, people say like they're benefiting from being, kind of neutral, not taking a side, getting investment from China, the U.S., Japan. Is that sustainable? Or do you, at some point, does countries in Southeast Asia need to be playing a larger role at the diplomatic stage globally? And what kind of role can Southeast Asian countries play?
None. I tell you what we mean. We often use this term, we don't want to take sides, right?